Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today I'll be going over the authentication logic that I've been working on for the past week or two. So in the backend, I am using the JWT token and also the Flask JWT extended library. And within the JWT token, I'm only using XS token for authentication. And I'm storing this token in HTTP only cookie. For the front end, I am using view router and navigation guards to prevent unauthorized URL accesses, and using Vuex for storage. So in the backend, I'll have 3 API endpoints: the register endpoint that registers users, and the login endpoint that will authenticate users, and the isme endpoint, which is used to authenticate a user before I refresh their tokens. And to refresh the token, I'm using this Flask decorator called app.afterRequest. And basically, I will have another function that will run after every request. And that function will check whether if I need to refresh the token or not. So in the register route, the front end is going to make a post request, and that's going to include the username, password, or some other information. And from there, the backend would hash the password and then save the username and hashed password to the database. For the login route, the username and password will get passed down to the backend, and the backend will query for the user. And if it doesn't find it, then it will handle the error. And if it does find a user, then it will verify the password. Once the password is verified, then it will create the access token and then save that to cookie. And then the isme endpoint is just going to it's going to verify the user and return the username. Now to refresh the token, I'm following the Flask JWT extended library. They have something called implicit refresh access token. Basically, what's going to happen is the front end is going to make a request to the back end, and the back end is going to respond regularly, but then it's going to have another response which decides whether to create a new access token or not. So basically, the back end is going to have 2 responses. So some of the downfall of this is that you are only able to refresh the access token if the JWT is not expired. And if it is expired, then you have to re-log in. So for the front end, as I said, I will have 3 routes: a login route, a register route, and also a home route. The home route is going to be the page that interacts with ChatGPT. And using router guards, I'll be able to protect the authenticated URLs. And then using Vuex store, I'm going to store user information and also whether if someone is authenticated or not in the store. Okay, so let's look at some code. So first, let's look at the register route. First, we will be grabbing the username and password from the requested body. And then here we would just do some ear checking to make sure the username and password field is not empty. Once we have the user information, then we would hash the password and then pass it to the user's data model. And from there, we will save it to the database. And if a user already exists, then you will return an error. And if this user didn't exist, then this will succeed and it will return success. Now for the login route, same thing. You will grab the information from the requested body, and then you would make a query to the database to check for the user. And once you got a user, then you will issue a access token. And if you don't have the user, if you can't query that user from the database, then you have the incorrect username. And if you do have the user, but then you can't verify the password, then you have the incorrect password. And once you have the access token, you would set it in the cookie by using the setAccessCookie function. And from there, you will return the response. I have the refresh token endpoint here, but I am currently not using it right now. And I have an isme endpoint. Basically, this endpoint basically checks that the user is still authenticated and that the JWT is still valid. And once that's true, it just gets the identity of the user and then returns the data. And this JWT required will basically check whether if the JWT is expired or not. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the backend code. Now let's look at some of the front-end code. Right, another thing I forgot to mention is the refreshing logic. So in my init.py file, this is where the creation of my app located. And within this function, I have a function called refresh expiring JWTs, and this has a decorator of after request. So basically, after each API request, this function will get called. And what this function is going to do is going to create a new access token if the token that you issued is about to expire. And as you can see here, we will get the expired timestamp of the JWT token, and then from there we'll get the current time, and we'll add 1 minute to it. And if the expired timestamp is within the target timestamp, then that means the token is about to expire, and therefore we will create a new access token and set it in the cookies, and from there we will return the response. So if, for example, your token, when you access a protected endpoint, your JWT token already expired, then this will basically error out and you won't be able to access the protected token. It will on the front end, it will redirect you to the login page to re-log in again. Okay, now let's talk about the front end logic. So in the front end, in the main.js, this is where you create the app. I am importing a router, and also I'm importing the store that I'm going to create, and I'm also using them here. So let's first look at this router file. Okay, so in the index.js, this file sits under the router directory under source. So basically, as you can see right here, I created routes. I have a login route, a home route, and then also a about page route. And from there, I'm pointing each of these routes to a component. So if I'm accessing this route, it will use the login view component. If I'm accessing the home route, it will use the home view component. If I'm accessing the about route, then I will use the about component. And you'll also notice that I have a meta field here as well. And this meta field, whether it basically tells you if this route requires authentication or not. In this case, the login route doesn't require authentication, so I set it to false. And the home route, which is the page that's going to display the chat interface, and that route requires authentication, so I'm setting it to true. So once I have the routes, I'm using the navguard, the router.beforeEach. I'm using this to basically check whether if a URL requires authentication or not. So the beforeEach will get executed before the page loads. And from there, it is able to check whether if a user is authenticated or not. And if it is authenticated, then we will be able to load that page. If it is not authenticated, then we will redirect it to the login page. And as you can see, I will first check the store for whether if the user is authenticated or not. And from there, if the user is not logged in and the route that they're trying to access requires authentication, then I will basically call another function. And this function here will make a GET request to the isMe endpoint on the backend to check whether if that user is still authenticated. If it is authenticated, then I will basically set the authentication to true, representing that the user is authenticated, right? And then from there, I'm able to check from there, then this is logged in will be true if the user is authenticated. Then if it is true, then it is able to access the protected route. And if it is not true, then that means the user is not logged in. From there, it will get redirected to the login page. Okay, next I'm going to show you guys the index.js file that's under the store directory. So basically, this is where I save the state of the application. In my state, I have two variables, authenticated and username. Initially, the state is false and the username is empty. And I have two getters that's able to get whether if the state is authenticated or whether if you can return a username. And then the mutation would be the functions that sets the states. And I don't have an action or modulo right now. So when would I set the states? I will set the states when I first log in. So if I go to my component, if I go to the login view, as you can see in this login method here, when I make a post request to the login page, if it successfully respond back a response, then I would set the authenticated to true, and then also set the username. And from here, if I want to, once the user is authenticated, then I will push the route to the home page. And this way, it could get redirected to the home page after the user logged in. So in this case here, when this .route.push is executed before the home page is actually loaded, if you recall, if I go back to the routers index.js file, this before each is going to get executed, right? And then from this function here, we will check the store, whether the is authenticated variable is set or not. And in this case, it's already set. Therefore, it is able to get redirected to the home page. Okay, so let's talk about some issues that I've been running into. So the first issue is being able to communicate between the front end and the back end. And to do this, I just have to set the course in the back end. And what I mean by this is, since I'm using the Flask course library for the resources, I need to allow this endpoint, this front endpoint, which sits on localhost 8080. That's where the front end app is hosted. I need to allow this connection. And this way, if a front end makes a request to the back end will allow the front end's connection. Once you have this set, then you're able to communicate between the front and the back end. A second issue I run into is when I set a cookie for my access token, when I store the access token in the cookie, it wasn't showing up in the front end. So what I mean by that is, if you go to your Firefox or just any browser, and if you go to the storage section, basically the cookies is not showing up here. And even though when I looked at the network tab and looked at the request header, it shows that the cookies, the set cookies field is there, but then it's not showing up in this cookies storage area. And I wasn't able to access those cookies in code. And the reason for that is because in the backend, I need to make sure that the access control allow credentials is set to true. And to do this, I will basically, in the course function, I will basically set the supports credentials to true. And once I've done this in the backend, I also need to set the XML HTTP request with credentials flag to true in the front end. And this was a bit confusing to me. And the reason for that is because the XML HTTP request with credentials flag is not showing anywhere in the request. So if you're kind of new to the front end development or the back end or just the full stack web development, it wasn't very clear that I'm supposed to set this flag. But to do this, since I'm using the Axio library, I will basically set the Axio's defaults with credentials to true. And once I have this set, then one last thing that I need to make sure is that when I run my app, everything, the front end has to be on, the front end and the back end has to be neither on localhost or it needs to be on the 127.0.0.1 address. So if your front end is on an IP address and your back end is on localhost, then that's not going to work. So everything has to be in the same URL. It could be different ports, but it has to be